Namaskar and welcome to Sansad Television. I am Vishal Dahiya and you're watching our show Perspective, where we bring you detailed analysis of key national and international issues. Today we're going to talk about the key takeaways from the 17th G20 Summit and the challenges ahead. Now, the 17th G20 Summit on Wednesday reaffirmed its commitment to address global economic challenges. In a declaration adopted at the end of the two-day summit, the G20 leaders said cooperation is necessary for global economic recovery and tackling global challenges and laying the foundation for a strong, sustainable, balanced and an inclusive growth as well. Most members strongly condemned the war in Ukraine, adopting in their declaration Prime Minister Narendra Modi's words used earlier in a meeting with Russian President Vladimir Putin that today's era must not be of war. Now, the declaration also expressed the commitment of member countries for more fruitful collaboration on issues such as food security, climate change, health, digital ecosystem, funds for poor countries, and supply chain issues as well. Indonesian President also handed over the G20 Presidency to Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi. India's G20 Presidency begins on 1st December, and the theme for this summit would be One Earth, One Family, One Future. Now, PM Modi also held bilateral discussions with world leaders on the sidelines of the summit. So what are the key takeaways from the Bali summit of G20, and what can we look forward to in the next year when India has the presidency of G20? For more on this, we're joined by a distinguished panel of experts. Let me first introduce them to you, beginning with former Ambassador S.R. Thayil, who is here with us in the studio. Welcome, Ambassador Thayil. We're also joined by Dr. A. Subramanian Raju. He's the Dean of International Relations at Pondicherry University, and Srajani Sinha, Chief Economist with the Care Edge Group, is also with us. Welcome, both of you as well. I'll begin with you, Mr. Thayil, and let's start by first understanding, or rather, trying to summarize as to what transpired over those 2 days in Bali, in Indonesia, at the 17th G20 Summit. The key aspects, the tangible achievements, as to say, in this particular summit.
The theme of the Bali summit was recover together, recover stronger, because the whole background was first of the COVID epidemic, which impacted the economies so badly, the global economies. And since February of this year, the Ukraine conflict, the Russia-Ukraine conflict, which has affected food security as well as energy security. So this was a time for the leaders to take stock of the situation where we are and how to move forward and how to reduce these disparities, differences, and so that the global south is not affected. I think the Prime Minister's message, as well as Indonesia is also a developing country. And it was that how to insulate the global economies from these two shadows which are coming of COVID and Ukraine war. I think in that direction there was a lot of discussion, a lot of statements were made, and I think a very good foundation was laid for India's presidency, and where the goals would be more clear and outcomes may be more tangible. The issues have been raised, foremost by our Prime Minister, that United Nations is not functioning as well as should be, financial institutions are not functioning. The global south should not suffer from any restrictions placed on energy markets, on food markets, on fertilizer markets. So this was perhaps a very good forum for the countries to exchange notes, see what are the main concerns of the member countries, and how to collectively move forward and deal with the shadow cast both by COVID pandemic and the Ukraine war.
Ms. Sinha, on the issue of economic recovery, and since the theme for the 17th G20 Summit was focused on that aspect only, how would you analyze the decisions taken or the discussions which happened between the world leaders at this particular stage vis-a-vis various aspects of this economic recovery? Either we're looking at the issues regarding health or supply chain or digital economy as well. Health being very important because almost all economies are trying to, recover from the pandemic shock.
So, Vishal, this whole summit has taken at a time at a very crucial juncture. Like my previous speaker just mentioned, we are coming out of a pandemic. We are still in a war situation. The global economy has experienced in the last 2 years a food and energy crisis. We have seen very high food inflation and energy inflation just when we were recovering from pandemic. Also, the pandemic taught us as to how dependent the economies are on each other and how critical it is to have closer ties with other economies. We realize as to how it's not possible for one economy to recover from the crisis when another part of the global economy is going through war. So the crisis taught us all these things in the last 2 years. And it has also provided some opportunity for economies like India. With this whole geopolitical tension that we have seen in the last 1 year or so, and this whole, two blocks that have formed with the West against Russia, the strife that we have been seeing, and then the other economies looking at China with suspicion. There is a lot of opportunity that has opened up for India. And this is the time when India has to come, show its leadership, show its potential, and try and utilize a lot of these opportunities that have been presented by the crisis, while also dealing with globalization and how to embrace globalization so that we benefit from each other's positives.
Okay. Dr. Raju, economic recovery topmost on everybody's agenda. And specifically when we are looking at G20, it's an amalgamation of both developed and developing economies, all equally affected by the pandemic and equally, affected by, almost equally affected by the Ukraine war as well. So clearly, this was the place, as both Mrs. Tayal and Ms. Sinha are pointing out, wherein everybody puts their head together to figure out where do we stand and what's the way forward. Is that right?
If you look at India is very well positioned, to take center stage in providing leadership. Because if you look at during pandemic, India has been, demonstrated in terms of providing the vaccine to most of the countries. And then 60% of the world's medicine was, our vaccine was produced by India. And India has really demonstrated the way, it was not only providing the vaccine to its own people, but then also to the rest of the world. That is one. And number two, when you look at how India can also play a very constructive role in terms of taking its, middle pathway where it is in a position to look at, as the previous speakers were talking about, the division between the European countries or Western countries and Russia and China, where India can also play a very constructive role to bring this all the countries to look for meeting the challenges. I think this is no country is in a position to address any challenge. Can be climate change or energy security or food security, or if you look at how looking at these protecting the international law, where we have the India has historically looking at how India has been respecting international law and how it has demonstrated, looking at the neighborhood or the countries across the world. And also when you look at, as you mentioned in your introduction, as our Prime Minister said, this is not an era of war. I think that is exactly has given a kind of, India is in a position to say to Russia that I think India is expecting that war cannot be a solution.
Okay.
So in that sense, when you look at how India could be seen as playing a very bigger role in terms of looking at how to prevent this economic crisis in future and how to bring all the countries together. And that is something very important. And we have these traditional values where we can look at how Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam, or looking at Samudra Manthan, which the mythology makes us to understand about these angels versus demons, where we have to protect now. This is the time for us to look and give a message across the world. It's not necessarily looking at only G20, but G20 can be a platform for India, not only to address these issues with G20, but also at larger level across the world. We're talking about state, when you're talking about Samudra Manthan can be conveyed to the across the world, that state cannot work against another state. It's a state versus threats. That's like climate change, like terrorism.
Those are, of course, very key elements there, Dr. Raju. And let me take that Ukraine issue to Ambassador Tayal here. Ambassador Tayal, on the Ukraine issue aspect, very interesting development in terms of declaration and behind-the-scenes story. If we go by the media reports, India played a very important role in finalizing that draft, which included the member countries' views on the Ukraine war issue. And the statement does include a sentence which was also, mentioned by Prime Minister Modi to President Putin quite a few weeks ago, that today's era is not that of war. That conveys a lot of feelings.
First thing is that G20 really is a forum to discuss economic issues. And in the declaration also this has been mentioned, that it is not a forum to discuss strategic issues. But of course, the Ukraine conflict has had economic consequences, and very serious economic consequences on food security as well as energy security. And the way it has, the whole declaration was in that reference to Ukraine has been made is very creatively being done, because UNGA resolutions have been quoted, and it has been said that most countries condemned or were strongly against the Ukraine war, etc. And the Prime Minister's very pithy statement that this is not the time of war finds a mention in this declaration. It has its own merit, its own value, and this needs to be heeded by all the belligerents. That means primarily Russia and Ukraine. President of Ukraine, Zelensky, was invited to address the G20, and he addressed remotely the G20. So they are very much a factor in the future economic prosperity of all the countries. And that is why the message which has gone from the Bali summit is clear, that cooperate. The primary message has come that all the countries agreed that they will cooperate very strongly. But how exactly they will cooperate, what will be the steps taken, how will it go beyond words, that is still to be seen. And there I would quote from Prime Minister in his closing statement. He said that India's chairmanship will be inclusive, ambitious, decisive, and action-oriented. I think that is a very, very clear path which we will take. And I will mention here that, as all of us know, already a lot of preparation has been done for our presidency, that what exactly we will seek to achieve. And so we will hit the ground running from 1st December. It is not that from 1st December India will decide what exactly will be the tangible outcomes of our presidency. From 1st December, we will start working on it and taking all the other 19 members together to come to some tangible outcomes in during our presidency.
Ms. Sinha, taking that thread forward, when we look at India's G20 presidency, and as Mr. Tayal was mentioning, a decisive, action-oriented steps to be taken, discussions to be held as well. What are the key areas which you believe the year ahead would focus on? Of course, economic recovery, sustainable development, health issues, all those will be part of it. But when we look at tangible outcomes.
So what is critical now and going forward in the next few years is that when the economies are just coming out of this pandemic situation, coming out of this war and pandemic crisis, the focus is on recovery. But we must not forget that we have to look at sustainable recovery, sustainable economic growth. And for that, there are some long-term requirements that has to be taken care of. And this is where, some of the things that you mentioned in terms of, what are we doing in terms of health infrastructure? Globally, what is the situation on that? What are we doing about climate change? What are we doing about inequality, income disparity? These are issues which are important for long-term sustainable growth, and these are the issues which should be taken up in the next meeting too.
Okay. Dr. Raju, as per your assessment, the key focus areas for the year ahead, now that India is taking over the presidency, and the theme which you were explaining, elaborating on in your previous response, how does that theme, gel with or should gel with the kind of issues which should take us which should take the center stage?
I think this is something very important when you look at about the center stage, because India is now in a position to look at, because this is somewhere, as I mentioned to you earlier, how India has been demonstrating as a leader. And that is something where we have demonstrated in terms of looking at how to mitigate the GHG emissions, and how we are looking about the international solar alliances, where we are trying to look at how to, look at the climate finance, and also how we are looking at, energy security, where we are looking at mostly depending on hydro or electricity or non-fossil fuels. And also when you look at this, health is a very primary sector. I think this is something very important, because any state, when you look at the primary objective is to protect the welfare of the people, and particularly health is the one very important aspect which we have witnessed in the during the pandemic. I think that is something where we also can think about it, and we can envisage our mission in terms of how health infrastructure or health, global health, and also energy, and also governance. I think this is something very important when we are talking about economic cooperation. Though G20 talks about economic cooperation, unless we have governance at global level, unless we have to meet the challenges like food security or energy security, or mitigate the GHG emissions, and that is something very important, and where India has committed towards addressing these challenges. That why I think India would be in a position to convince the other leaders of G20, where it can be taken further to address some of these challenges in the due course.
Okay. Ambassador Tal, do you agree that issues like climate change, issues like sustainable development is pretty much dependent upon how we deal with the achievement of SDG goals as well? And then let's not forget, health being a very important area here. And India has shown the way ahead. Digital economy, another one, how to move ahead on those paths. So these might be the key focus areas where perhaps in the next year, during the course of discussions, we can tell the world that this is how we have done it. Perhaps, this is the best way.
That is one, that India's story is a very successful story, very grand story, whether it is digital transformation, whether it is giving all the vaccines and pharmaceuticals to 1.3 billion people. So that is one, but ultimately if we look at economic way forward, finance becomes very important. And hints have already been given that how India will try to push for reform of financial institutions like IMF, World Bank, etc., not in a political way of voting percentages, etc., but how to make cheap credit available, how the existing funds can be made available at a cheaper credit for more infrastructure development and more focus towards the developing world.
Okay.
And even for climate change, ultimately money has to be transferred to the developing countries for mitigation, and the whole, and that their growth story is not impeded. Their developing countries need to develop, and so the new technologies, green technologies, which will emerge, which are bound to emerge from the West, they should be made available at a very concessional rate to the developing countries. So I think in Indian thinking, and there has been a lot of thinking, there are some very specific points on which India will try to bring all the countries together so that the global challenges of growth, hunger, energy and climate change are dealt with cooperatively without harming the developmental aspect of developing countries, and transfer of technology as well as financial resources from the developed world to developing countries.
Okay. Ms. Sinha, quick concluding comment in terms of those key areas which Mr. Tayal is referring to. Perhaps that sums up the year ahead as far as G20 deliberations are concerned. Food security, energy security, climate change issues, sustainable development, and all of this combined then leads to, the path to sustainable economic recovery as well.
Yes, definitely. Like I mentioned earlier, if we are talking about sustainable economic growth, these aspects of energy security, food security, and health infrastructure becomes very critical. And also, like we spoke about, the digital transformation, because that is a big wave that's sweeping across economies, and India has taken a big lead there, and it has a lot to show to other economies there. So going forward, all these issues will be very critical, and specifically the pandemic, the kind of the food crisis and energy crisis that we have seen during the pandemic, it highlights the high risk of something like this happening and again. And hence, all the economies need to be prepared to mitigate this kind of risk. And globally, the nations need to plan for future in such a way that we do not face these risks again going forward.
Okay. So there it is. Thank you so much, Ms. Rajni Sinha, Dr. Subramaniam Raju, and Mr. Tayal as well for sharing your views and insight. As our experts were pointing out, not only the key takeaways from the 17th G20 Summit, which concluded in Bali in Indonesia, but also the road ahead, the challenges which will now have to be deliberated upon, and the solutions, being found for those challenges during the course of next 1 year when India has the presidency of G20. There will be a lot of deliberations which will take place in almost 200 odd meetings during this particular year, and we'll keep you updated on all those developments. Till then, keep watching Sansad Television. Thank you.